I think it has a lot to do with a generation gap, right? Like elders, um, their their life experience was totally different than us growing up in the US, and even just having the language to talk about mental health.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to Positionality Podcast. This is episode 2. I am Rinzen, your host. Before we dive into our discussion today, I want to thank everyone for supporting our first episode, which was about the Black Lives Matter. And I also want to acknowledge Tenzin Chiang. She works in the background with me to make this podcast possible and make sure everything is running smoothly. So just want to give a shout out to Tenzin over there. So for this episode, we are focusing on mental health in the Tibetan community. You know, mental health is a very personal topic for everyone, but for me as well. And you know, I've dealt with it all. Like I've personally struggled with mental health ever since college, and I'm still struggling. You know, I think it's a part of me. It definitely doesn't define me, but it is something that I still have a huge connection to. And having been from, you know, being a Tibetan as well as living in the American community, I've noticed a huge shift in our Tibetan culture where mental health is not something that's talked about often. So I want to kind of explore that topic a little bit today, mental health in the Tibetan community. And I have someone very special. It's a treat. Dr. Kunga Norzom, joining all the way from Minnesota. She currently works with the individual group therapy and cognitive and personality testing with teens and adults. She's the founder of Tibetan Mental Health on social media that reduces barriers between the Tibetan community and mental health through education and awareness. You guys can follow that on Instagram or Facebook. You can just type in Tibetan Mental Health. Welcome, Dr. Kunga Norzom.
Thank you. Nice to meet you finally.
Yeah, I feel like I've like always stalked your page, the Tibetan Mental Health. So it's kind of surreal to like actually be here and talk with you. We're both very appreciative that you're here today and finally get to talk about mental health and the Tibetan community. So thank you for that. So Dr. Kunga Norzom, can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background? What do you specialize in? What your journey was like leading up to working as a therapist today?
Yeah. So I started out, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I immigrated with my family in the 90s, just like a lot of Tibetans here in the US. Came here as a preteen. Now I'm in my 30s, so you know I've spent majority of my life here in the US, living in between two cultures. And as you know how that is, right? Like trying to understand yourself and where you fit in these different cultures and developing your identity and your attachment. So that experience was really interesting and also empowering. Like, wow, like, you know, I didn't really understand myself, but didn't really have a lot of role models because we were one of the first immigrants, right? So was as far as role models in these fields, mental health, or just academic role models. So a lot of these experiences were first experiences for me, and just navigating through this alone, whether it was my own identity development or just the college experience, because no one really, you know, my parents don't have college education, so no one was there to teach me like this is how you're supposed to do it. So so that really empowered me to get my education. So I got my undergrad and master's in social work, and through that experience, you know, at that time I was working as a case manager in child protection. And I don't know if you guys are familiar with child protection, but it is a really tough job because you're working with a lot of abused and neglected children and a lot of trauma, right? Like parents' trauma that wasn't treated and is now passed down to the children, and how that's impacting their ability to be present in their kids' lives. So much trauma, right? So that really inspired me to to do something about it. But I didn't want to get a PhD in social work to just teach and do research. That wasn't something I felt connected to. So I got my doctorate in psychology because I wanted to do more therapy and one-on-one individual work, and also psychological testing. So I graduated, did that. So it took me 10 years. And it sounds like a really long time, but it does go by fast, especially when you're passionate about something that you're doing, right? So I graduated with my doctorate like 2 years ago, or 2018, yeah. And then I started the Tibetan mental health page just because when I was in school, I didn't really hear or see anything about Tibetan people's mental health experience or resources, or just even discussion in public spaces. So that really inspired me to there's something missing, and I can really use my training and skills and my Tibetan language to connect with Tibetans all over the world, right? Sadly, I can't read or write in Tibetan, but I can speak Tibetan. So that was a really great tool in connecting with Tibetans from India, Nepal, Europe, Canada, US, all over the world, all different age groups. So that has been really empowering, and just using my knowledge and wisdom to educate our community. Doesn't matter if you're like a teenager or in your 20s, or someone elder who's in their 50s and 60s.
Right. Wow, that's amazing. Does juvenile detention count as a child protected service?
Yeah. So that was that was my first internship actually in undergrad, and that was because I interned before then. Sorry, my internship was in a men's anger management program. It was a court mandated population, meaning the court sent them and they had to do it no matter what because of domestic violence cases. So, and I was seeing these adults, these young adults and older adults with domestic violence background, and just really being able to understand their childhood, their own history, and how it's a culmination of all these factors, contributed to their behavior, and that their thought process and their attitude about women, and just what does it mean to be a man, right? And their core beliefs, to be able to change that and to see that potential in them, regardless of their criminal background. They still have this potential to be a better person in life, be a better father, a better partner, right? A better son. So that really inspired me to understand human behavior. And I was like, wow, like people are not born this way. Like how does this happen, right? Like where do these adults, how does this happen to them? Because they have so much potential. So that really inspired me to volunteer at the Hennepin County Juvenile Detention Center, which is in Minneapolis downtown. And I met these really cool young kids. They're like 11, 12, 15, 16-year-old boys, sadly in juvenile detention center for, quick decisions that they made that sadly has a long-term consequence, right? Like some kids were there for many years because of gang violence and shooting. And a lot of them had so much, they were very talented. I remember this one kid, he was super talented artist. He would draw like pictures for all these kids on the pod, but he knew that he was going to be locked up for like 15 years. And to really understand, how did this happen? How do these kids end up in these situations? Whether it's parents are working two jobs, or lack of supervision, lack of access to positive experiences or healthy environments, right? Like whether it's even going to a gym, that's not free, right? It's a privilege. So how does our society let these kids down? That was really empowering to really connect the childhood experience and then the adult decisions, right? And really understand them on that level.
Yeah, I don't know if I told you this or if I mentioned it, but I also worked at a juvenile detention.
Oh, cool.
Summer of my sophomore year.
Yeah.
And I remember they were some of the brightest kids.
Yeah.
With mostly age from 11 to 18 or 17.
Mm-hmm.
they're just some of the most loving, warm kids. It's just their parents are so messed up that they have a hard childhood, and it when your parents don't show up for visitation day, it really does numbers on you, and you act out, and the system see you as a child that's acting out and that needs to be still in the detention center. And it's really sad to see, but they were some of the most loving and smartest kids I've ever met, and I still miss them to this day.
Mm.
Go back. But to step aside from that a little bit, and going into the Tibetan community, right? From my experience, mental health was never openly talked about in the Tibetan community. I mean, this is my experience, okay? I'm not saying, the Tibetan community itself, because I only know a small portion of what the Tibetan community is.
Mm-hmm.
But in the past, whenever there's a talk about mental health, or when I say something like, oh yeah, I have anxiety issues, like not issues, but I suffer from anxieties, and all that, they've always kind of just like, pray, it's okay, you'll get better, just make sure you pray. But feel like there's a sense of there's a culture that's like kind of like, get over it, you'll be okay. Why do you think that is so?
Mm-hmm. So part of this is, I think it's important not to generalize, right? Like there are Tibetan parents who are very supportive elders who are able to be there for their kids the way that their kids need them to be, right? So I think that's important to emphasize. But I feel like just my own experience working with Tibetans, and this is not my opinion, this is based on what I've heard and seen, and heard from Tibetans who have reached out to me. I think it has a lot to do with a generation gap, right? Like elders, their their life experience was totally different than us growing up in the US. And even just having the language to talk about mental health, like you say anxiety, right? Like in the Tibetan culture, we may just have one word to describe that. And I'm sure there is a word, I don't know, but even our parents, like there are a lot of Tibetan parents who don't know how to read and write in Tibetan because they didn't never had access to education, right? Even that, how that really prevents them from connecting with their kids. Because if you just have one word to describe anxiety, that doesn't cover everything that you want to explain or express, right? So language barrier, definitely. And also our elders are very tough, right? Like they're coming from these really traumas that they experience that they have never been able to talk about because that's just part of life. Everyone struggled that way. It was a shared trauma, a collective trauma, right? So you can't just say, oh, poor me. Everyone, all the Tibetans went through that.
Right?
Yeah. So part of this is like you need to toughen up or you need to suck it up. That's their coping mechanism, right? And also mental health in a lot of Asian cultures is associated with like evil spirits or karma, right? Like you did something bad in your previous life to deserve all this misfortune today. So that means that we need to pray harder or donate to charity or really do a lot of good work, right, to build that positive energy. So that may be their only coping mechanism. So if you go to them, that's what they're going to tell you because they don't know anything else, right? How many of our Tibetan elders have friends who have gone to therapy? Probably not a lot or none, right? So compared to us, we know a lot of our friends who have gone to therapy or continue to go to therapy, whether they're Tibetan or non-Tibetans. So our exposure to mental health is different than our parents, right? And if we grew up in our parents' generation, we would probably be that way too.
Wow, I think that's really important to understand. I from my perspective, I can often be like, why is the Tibetan community not talking about mental health?
Yeah.
But really, our parents, they've suffered so much trauma, and it's a collective trauma, and their way of coping is different from mine, or people our age. From your talk, I got two things. So privilege, one of them is privilege. You and I are able to have these conversation on this podcast, you doing your practice, and even just having the ability to go to school and learn about all these stuff, and me being able to go to a therapy session if I wanted to. Like I could just make a phone call and I can get there.
Mm-hmm.
So I acknowledge my privileges in that way. But what are some of the privilege you notice as in your profession and being a Tibetan, being able to talk about this stuff?
Yeah. So just having, like you said, like having access to intellectual spaces like this, right? Or even having access to um, these online spaces, these support groups, right? Our parents are very limited in um, who they can talk to, right? And it's usually people who are like-minded, who grew up in a very homogenous community, right? Everyone thinks like the same way, they have same belief system. So nothing really changes, right? Like change is really hard and slow when you're part of a system like that, right? And so for the younger generation, we have gone to college and have been able to meet and connect with people from all backgrounds, versus our parents, they just grew up in this Tibetan community where everyone was kind of alike, right? So that's a privilege that we have as younger people, being able to access all these diverse spaces, whether it's online or in person. And also, privilege of, we don't have to work as hard as our parents did, right? Especially the new immigrants. First, when our parents first settled, like the first parent who immigrated first, and then rest of the family came. Like that was my mom in my family who first immigrated in the early 90s, and that must have been so hard for her, right? Like because I think my younger brother was like only 2 years old when she came here. So imagine, like, we don't even talk about that, right? How that must have impacted her her just being a mom and feeling guilty, like, wow, I'm not there for my baby, I'm here like thousands of miles away in this new country. But also thinking about that long-term goal, if I sacrifice right now, then my children, my entire family will have better life in the future, right? So it takes a really strong person to be able to sacrifice all that, your own wants and needs, to reach that bigger goal, right? And a lot of our parents did that, right? So I think using compassion and empathy is really important when we feel frustrated dealing with our parents. Like, why can't you understand? Because our parents are very resilient, right? Like there's so much we can learn from our elder generation, and there's things that we can teach them too. It goes both ways, right? It has to be bi-directional.
Agree. You know, just I have so much respect for Tibetans or anyone really that
Yeah.
their own comfort, their own country, to move to somewhere like America, to
Mm-hmm.
make a new home and separated from their family. It takes so much from them, and I have so much respect for any parents or anyone that has done that or do that. Just want to give a shout out for that.
Yes.
But jumping back to how, in our Tibetan culture, sometimes we look at mental health as like a bad karma or something like that. Buddhism is a big part of the Tibetan culture, and when there's sometimes problems, we often pray. And I think there's nothing wrong in that. I think that's amazing. Everyone has different coping mechanism, but I also know that it's not feasible for everyone. For someone like me, I grew up in the U.S. since like I was 12, and I've practiced Buddhism on the side, but like where I live, it's not very exposed. So I need another outlet as well. So how can we go about balancing both? Where I know that's a lot of experience for a lot of the Tibetan Americans today. How can we do both, where you can practice your Buddhism, but like also be open about discussing mental health?
Right, right. So everyone's different, right? What you need today may not be what you need like next year, right? So your needs are going to change, and maybe today what you need is a therapist who can really help you understand your thoughts and talk to you, right? Versus Buddhism, there isn't much of that processing happening, right? It's just you and these perspectives. versus when you go to therapy, then there's a therapist, a professionally trained person who has skills to explore these thoughts, right? To give you feedback, is another person who you're talking to. Versus Buddhism, it's more internalizing and to really exploring that on your own. It's kind of a solo journey, right? When you're meditating, when you're praying. So I think the human interaction is really important, where therapy is able to give you that without fear of judgment or shame and stigma. And it's a combination of a little bit of this, and that, right? So if Buddhism is something that works for you, I think that's great. But even His Holiness says all the time that prayer is not everything, right? Like you can't just pray. You have to actually take steps and to take action to change things, right? Prayer isn't going to help everything. So I think it's really important to do what's best for you. But I've had a lot of Tibetans who've reached out to me where they've reached a point where they've tried everything, right? They went to the Gompa. That's the first instinct, I think, for a lot of Tibetans. I need spiritual guidance. I think that's great. Do that. And if you feel like that's not helping or improving, then I think it's good to look at what other options are out there, right? And that's the privilege that we have living in the US. And why not use that, right? Take advantage of that, because a lot of Tibetans in India and Nepal and other parts of the world don't have that privilege, right? So I think it's important to understand what is it that you're needing, and to be honest with yourself. If Buddhism isn't helping you, then being honest instead of just like following that blindly, right? Because your mom thinks that's good for you.
Yeah, I agree with that. But kind of going back, you did touch a little bit about this. How is trauma carried through generations? What are some signs to watch, to be on a watch for?
Mm-hmm. I think it's really the reason why I talk about emotional awareness is because if you're not aware, then you're less likely to take action to change these harmful behaviors, attitudes, narratives in your family, right? Because trauma impacts people in different ways. So trauma even before you were born, right? Like when your mom was pregnant with you, or your mom's own trauma when she was a kid that wasn't processed or treated, could affect her ability to be present in her interactions with you, or her ability to emotionally be available for you, or her ability to manage conflict, right? Or her availability to be there for you or comfort you because she's so distressed, right? So I think it's really important to understand your family history, right? So you understand like, oh, that was really traumatic. I wonder how that impacted my parents and our interaction today. And also trauma can influence your personality, right? Like people have trouble saying no, or because they experienced a lot of abuse or neglect, and they're afraid that if they say no, something bad may happen, right? So people pleasing behavior can happen. Avoiding conflict all the time because you don't know how to do that because you never learned that, right? Communication, boundaries, right? Boundaries are so important. So I think it's really important to understand how trauma can impact your entire family and even your future generations if you don't do something about it today. Okay, because we don't have power over what happened before us, right? We can't control our parents' behavior because they are a separate being, but you do have control over your actions and your behavior. So if you think you can, go to therapy and understand yourself better, and why do I do the things that I do, and why do I act this way or feel this way, trying to make those connections so that you're more aware of this trauma in your family so that you can be a better parent for your child.
I completely agree with that. We're running out of time, but before that, I do want to ask, do you get a lot of Tibetan clients, or have you seen Tibetans that want to seek treatments?
Yeah, so therapy is a little different, right? I can't work with Tibetans outside of Minnesota because of licensing guidelines, because your therapist has to be licensed in the state that you live. So sadly, because of that, I haven't been able to work with a lot of Tibetans in other states. But I have worked with, in the state of Minnesota, I've worked with a couple Tibetans. So that's been really great, actually.
That's awesome. I remember in college, when I first knew I needed to go see a therapist, I remember just not sleeping for like a day or two and just keep going and studying. And I just knew I needed to get help. So college was the first time I went to go see a therapist. But even then, this was like my freshman year, and I knew I needed to go get help, but
Mhm.
the thought of getting help just scared me, because to me that said something was wrong with me.
Mhm.
I was not not good enough for the school, or that I'm not um, able to take care of myself. But
Mhm.
we had a lot of resource on campus that seek encourage us to go to therapy, and I'm really glad I did, because I still go to therapy today, just to talk about my anxieties and stuff, and I encourage everyone to go. But what advice would you give to someone right now that want to seek treatment, but kind of maybe afraid of being judged?
Right. I think it's important to be honest with yourself again. And to be honest, when I say to be honest, thinking about how long can you live like this, right? How long can you tolerate this, hiding your struggles? And why should you, right? Like, you have the right to live a free and happy life, but if you're always trying to hide this, then it makes it into a shame. Like, it tells you, like, okay, this is something you need to be ashamed of, right? When you hide something. So that's what our culture does. It teaches us to be ashamed of these topics, to be ashamed of bringing it up, right? So part of this is challenging that narrative and saying, why should I be ashamed? Therapy, everyone goes to therapy for so many different reasons, like you said, Rinzi, right? Like, it doesn't mean that you have to have severe problems. And that's the myth, right? Like, people wait until things get really bad, when they have suicidal ideations, or when they can no longer tolerate it. So I think it's important to think about therapy in the early stages, so that things don't get so bad where you have to quit your job, your school, and all these big decisions, right? So therapy is very non-threatening. Find that person that fits your needs, that makes you feel comfortable, where you can just be yourself, and you can take off your mask, right, that you put on every day in front of your parents, pretending everything is okay, because pretending, that just increases your anxiety a lot, and your body's in constant stress, and that's not good for your mental health or your physical health.
Right. um so we're running out of time. Do you have anything else to add?
um, I think what you're doing is really great. I think we just need to keep talking about it publicly. I know a lot of people privately talk about this, right, with their friends, but publicly it has the power of inspiring and encouraging other Tibetans who may be listening privately, right, not having that safe person to talk to. So I really want to thank you, Rinzi and Binzi, for doing this, because you don't know how many people are going to be impacted by this. And if you need resources, feel free to reach me through Tibetan Mental Health. I will definitely try my best to guide you through this process.
Yes. We definitely hope, through this talk, it normalizes mental health, or talking about mental health. That's why we're doing it. But thank you, Dr. Kunga Norzom. We're so glad you were able to join us. I certainly learned a lot, even though I thought I knew stuff. But like you being here definitely helped. And guys, please like our YouTube channel, comment if you have any topics that you want us to discuss, or any guests that you want us to bring on. Please let us know. You can message us at Positionality Podcast, either on Instagram or on YouTube. But yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you.